New York City, 1902. This was the Gilded Age, a time when the giant marble mansions of the Upper East Side held more gold than the actual national treasury. It was the era of the 400, a tiny group of the richest people on Earth who threw $10,000 dinner parties. At these events, guests used silver spoons to dig for real diamonds hidden in bowls of expensive sand. That world existed. It was real. This is not that story. 5 miles south, the air changed from the scent of lavender to the smell of coal ash. In this part of the city, the only diamonds you would find were the ones being cut out of silk pockets in the dark. What you are about to see is a reconstruction built directly from the 1894 Lexo Committee testimonies and handwritten NYPD precinct ledgers. We have used the haunting photography of Jacob Riis and the private journals of a veteran officer named Copper, James Quirk, to bring this world back to life. Every academy of art, the secret schools where children learn to steal, is documented in the 1901 Tenement House Commission reports. In this investigation, we aren't interested in rumors. Every detail you see is verified by the records they left behind. To understand why a child would choose a life of crime, you first have to look at the math of where they lived. In the 10th ward of the Lower East Side, the density was staggering. Imagine 1,200 people packed into every single acre of sunless brick. This was made possible by double-decker tenements. These buildings were designed with a cold, simple logic: maximize the rent by sacrificing the air. According to the official 1894 Gilder report, walking into these buildings felt like entering another world. The hallways were described as a perpetual twilight. They were stained with the smell of stale beer, sewer gas, and unwashed humanity. Think of a space about the size of a 2-car garage, roughly 300 square feet. Now, imagine a family of 8 people living, cooking, and sleeping inside it. The data from city inspectors tells us this wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a physical weight. The air was a mix of moist, heavy heat and clotted darkness. There was no ventilation and very little light. For a person visiting from the wealthy uptown mansions, a room like this looked like a tomb. But for the people stuck inside, this cramped, dark space was a biological necessity. It was the only place they could afford to exist. When the environment is built to suffocate you, the rules of the outside world start to matter much less than the need to survive the night. Inside these crowded walls, survival wasn't about feelings. It was about cold, hard math. The economy of the slum was built on what was called the sweating system. In this system, your home was also your factory. A 10-year-old child would spend a staggering 14 hours a day finishing knee pants, sewing the final touches on clothing until their fingers were raw. For those 14 hours of labor, that child would earn only 50 cents. The numbers here tell a brutal story. In 1902, rent for a single, dark room was about $10 a month. If a child worked 6 days a week, 312 days a year, they would bring home a total of $156. That is just barely enough to keep the door open and the landlord away. If you couldn't produce enough, or if you got sick, the result was the curbstone. This was the official name for a documented state of homelessness, living on the literal edge of the street with nowhere to go. Think about a boy like Moppy Heller. At just 11 years old, the world offered him 2 very different paths. The first path was honest work, sitting at a sewing machine for 5 cents an hour until his back curved and his eyes failed. The second path was the street. In the time it takes to take a deep breath, Moppy could make $5, 10 days worth of honest wages, just by reaching into a pocket on a moving streetcar. For these children, the choice wasn't about being good or bad. It was a simple calculation of time and money. When the honest path leads to the curbstone, the dishonest path starts to look like the only way to stay alive. This environment of extreme poverty created an opportunity for a different kind of predator. Hovering over these vulnerable children was a layer of organized crime known as the Pickpocket Academy. These schools were often run by adults called the Kidsman. One documented example is Mother Herman, a woman who ran her business out of a cramped basement on Essex Street. She didn't teach math or reading. She taught the mechanical skill of theft. The way they trained children was chillingly efficient. A life-size dummy was hung from the ceiling, and its clothes were covered in dozens of tiny, sensitive bells. The Kidsman would place a single silver coin deep inside one of the dummy's pockets. To graduate, and be sent out to work. A child had to reach into the pocket and remove that coin without making a single bell ring. If the dummy stayed silent, the child was ready for the street. But you have to look at how the money actually flowed to see the real trap. This system was designed for maximum profit with zero risk for the adults in charge. The Kidsman would take 80% of everything the child stole. The child, often hungry and desperate, kept only a tiny fraction. Yet, the child was the one standing on the crowded street corner, facing 100% of the danger. If a hand was caught in a pocket, the Kidsman remained safe in their basement, while the child was thrown into the Black Maria, the heavy, black police wagon that hauled people off to jail. It was a business model where the small and the weak paid the highest price, while the people at the top stayed invisible and rich. When the city finally noticed these children, the official response came from the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Their goal sounded noble. Their stated principle was to rescue the child from the contagion of vice. In simpler terms, they wanted to pull children away from the disease of crime before it spread. But when we look at the 1902 State Board of Charities records, we see a very different reality. For a child living on the streets, being rescued usually meant being sent to the House of Refuge on Randall's Island. This wasn't a school or a home. It was a paramilitary institution. Upon entering, the children were stripped of their identities. They were no longer called by their names. They were assigned numbers. They marched in lines, wore rough uniforms, and lived under strict, military-style rules. The gap between the idea of protection and the reality of prison was as cold and hard as a steel gate. Think of it this way. If you take a child who has been forced to steal to survive and put them in a cage with hundreds of other children in the same situation, you aren't solving the problem. You are just concentrating it. The House of Refuge didn't stop the cycle of crime. It simply refined the criminal. These children didn't learn how to rejoin society as equals. Instead, they learned how to survive a harder, more organized system. By the time they were released, the rescue had often done more damage than the streets ever could. The system claimed to be saving them, but the records show it was really just hiding them away. The true price of this system wasn't paid in silver coins, but in human lives. We know this because of the death maps created during that era. These maps tracked where diseases struck the hardest, and the results were staggering. In the neighborhoods where the pickpocket schools operated, the rate of tuberculosis was 400% higher than the rest of the city. Because the air in the tenements never moved, a single cough could sentence an entire floor of children to death. The data from the Ludlow Street Jail gives us an even clearer look at this tragedy. Public health records show that many juvenile delinquents, the official term for these young street workers, often died before they ever saw a judge. The cause of death was frequently listed as emaciation and pulmonary distress. In plain English, these children were starving to death while their lungs failed in the damp, dark cells. These children were not treated as individuals with stories. They were processed like broken equipment. When there was no family to claim them, they were taken to the potter's field on Hart Island. This was a massive, lonely graveyard for the poor. The official ledgers there contain thousands of entries that simply say unknown boy or foundling. They disappeared from the city's records as quietly as they had lived. They were born in the shadows of the tenements, worked in the shadows of the streetcars, and were finally buried in the shadows of history. The records don't show tears or prayers. They only show a long, silent list of numbers that used to be children. History is rarely a simple story of heroes and villains, and the life of Reverend Charles Loring Brace is a perfect example of this tension. Brace was the founder of the Children's Aid Society, and he was deeply shaken by what he saw on the streets. He looked at the thousands of homeless children, whom he called street Arabs, and decided that the city itself was the problem. To him, New York was a sinkhole of crime that no child could survive. His solution was bold and massive. He launched the orphan trains. He believed the only way to save a pickpocket was to drain the city of its poor and send them far away to the fresh air of the American West. Over several decades, Brace successfully moved 200,000 children out of New York City by train. On the surface, this sounds like a grand rescue mission. He was moving children from dark tenements to open farm country. But when we look at the documented testimonies of the children themselves, the picture becomes much more complicated. For many of these kids, this wasn't a rescue. it was a transfer of labor. When the train stopped in small towns, children were often lined up on platforms like cattle for local farmers to inspect. They were chosen based on how strong they looked or how much work they could do in a field. In the process, brothers and sisters were often permanently separated, never to see each other again. They were given new names and new lives, but their own choices were completely ignored. Their agency, their power to decide their own future, was stripped away. Riis may have saved their lives from the disease and crime of the slums, but he effectively erased who they were to do it. He provided a future, but at the cost of their past. We are left with a difficult truth. A person can try to do the right thing and still cause a different kind of lasting harm. We return now to Essex Street in 1902. Take a final look around. You have seen the sunless rooms where air was a luxury. You have seen the dummies covered in tiny bells and the 14-hour shifts that wore children down to the bone. You have seen the quiet rows of the potter's field. Traditional history books often look at these children and ask if they were naturally bad or if they simply failed to be good people. But as we have seen today, that question ignores the brutal math of the 10th Ward. When survival is a calculation, the options are limited. If your life depended on the silence of a tiny bell or the slow, coughing death of a sweatshop, which silence would you choose? It is easy for us to sit here today and judge the choices of the past. In fact, we often judge people from 100 years ago just so we don't have to look at the same problems happening in our own world today. We like to think we are different, but the data shows that human behavior is often just a reaction to the world around us. These children didn't choose to be invisible, and they didn't choose to be forgotten. They were simply trying to solve the problem of tomorrow morning. If you believe that the records of these lives are worth preserving, and if you think we should learn from the facts rather than just the fairy tales of history, hit the subscribe button. By staying connected to these stories, you ensure that these names aren't erased from the record a second time. Let's keep looking at the data together so we can see the world as it really was and as it really is.